As a potter, I've been working on and off for the last 15 or 20 years, but intermingling that with full-time work. So the work in this exhibition is from a body of work I made last year that comprised my first solo exhibition. And I guess the influences in my work come from interest and love of domestic objects, and in particular the way we use and hold and cherish things, and in particular how things age. So I guess things like chairs and fabrics that sag and erode after lots of use. And the reason I like working with porcelain is because it tends to shift around a little bit in the kiln under high temperatures, so it tends to have a little bit of a life of its own, I guess. So it's easy to use it as a sensitive medium that I guess brings its own character to the process, and I can also get that sense of the worn and the age just through the shape. And in this work in particular, I guess the inspiration for it has come from the fabrics and the upholsteries within my own house. And I guess it also has a relationship to my mother and her role as a domestic person. Like, she was a mother and a housewife, and that was her love. So yeah, it's sort of a homage to her at the same time.
This work actually explores the emotional responses to the objects within this house that I grew up in. It's a red brick house built in 1957 in Cronulla, in this area. So, and it's actually one of the first red brick homes in the area. And this is a picture of my parents and my grandmother and my uncle standing on the balcony the first day they moved in. And this work is about 50 years later, when they sold the house. And on the last day, I went in there and I went back into the home and looked at the objects within that house and wanted to actually make a work about those emotional responses that I was feeling at that time. It was a very, very strange thing going back to your home for the last time and going through the stuff and realising the layer upon layer of these objects that you grew up with, that at some stage you probably discarded and didn't want to know about, and then come back and just see how these kind of objects that have, you know, a lot of them are sort of kitsch, funny things that you've collected throughout your childhood and adolescence, and then come back and revisit them. And what I began to do is, and I've written about this as well, I tried to unpack these emotional responses, thinking about that nostalgia that you initially feel and what that's about, and how overwhelming that can be, and how it can sort of distort reality, and how it's sort of an innate coping mechanism you have in times of distress. And I came to realise that really it was a reaction against like that passing of time and that distortion of reality, and sort of facing your mortality, really. So that's what this work's just about.
I'm very concerned with the environment and where I live, my locality. So my work is about how I live, where I live. And ceramics is very energy intensive generally as a practice. So I've tried to reduce my energy use, and I've done that by only using clay that I can find just around my house where I live. So the pots themselves are made from local clay, which is immediately available. It's not very good clay. In fact, it hardly has any clay in it at all. It's mostly ground up rock dust, which means that the things I make, I can't throw vigorously. They have to be nurtured and coaxed along. So the work is very tiny because that's all you can really fashion out of rock dust. And the glazes are made from rocks as well, which I collect locally just off the side of the road. And I grind them up and mix them with ashes from the fireplace. I have a wood-fired kitchen stove, and so I collect the ashes after cooking dinner and mix it with the rock dust, and that makes the glazes. The blue that's in this glaze here comes from opalescence in the glaze, which comes from having a tiny bit of bone ash, burnt bones. So I bought a cow and raised it for a year, and when it went to the abattoir, I got all the bones back as well as the meat, and ground up the bones, fired them in the kiln, calcined them, and add just a small amount of ground up bone ash to the glaze, and that brings out the iridescent blue colour. So bone ash contains phosphorus, and phosphorus is something you can't find just wandering around and picking it up off the ground. It only occurs in parts per million in soil. So by buying a cow, the phosphorus which is naturally available in the soil is taken by the grass and becomes grass. The cow eats the grass, digests it and takes the phosphorus and makes it into bone, and then at the end of its life I took the cow and the bones and ground them up. So it's organic phosphorus in a way, and it's absolutely local, and it could only be done living where I live with the things that I do and the attitudes I have. So these pots represent me in my environment.
Firstly, my work is all about how organisms cluster and mass. So that's sort of the inspiration for this sprawling configuration. And every time I put them up and put them together, there will always be a different form appear. There's not one set form that I set myself to put up, but it just evolves over time. And it's all about that evolution of species and form in nature. So it's very much set within the natural processes of life, and two key elements, and that of carbon and blood as essential elements within living organisms, us included. And I've just been exploring through each piece. Each piece has a certain texture. Some are more sort of muscular, so looking at the development of muscles. Some have texture on them. Some have a sort of faint hint of an eye appearing. So they're all in a different stage of evolution within themselves. And but mainly this whole idea of species moving as a collective. And what I've been looking at in particular is swarming fish and flocks of birds that move collectively together as one organism. So, you know, when you see a flock of birds moving across the sky, they have this whole image made up of singular, different personalities or different species, but or individual species, but moving in a joint process. So
this work is combining a lot of habits and tendencies and interests of mine, I suppose. It's in a way about walking. It's also about canoeing, and it's also about the place where I grew up on Middle Harbour in Sydney. When I was a teenager, I had a kayak, and I used to kayak up to the mangroves of the harbour, and then eventually started to sort of climb up the pathways to the bush above. But after I'd done it a few times, I got incredibly disillusioned, because what I usually encountered were suburban rubbish tips and a lot of kind of degradation of the environment. So I stopped doing it. And but in recent years, I started to do walks around Sydney, to bushland areas in Sydney, and I returned to this place, which is actually Sugarloaf Hill in Middle Harbour. But I approached it by driving and then doing a walk from the top right down to the bottom of it. So the work's slightly redemptive in the sense of trying to revisit this place and see how beautifully it's been tamed as a natural bushland area. And I'm a collector. I collect stuff, and I like to reconvene it or compose with it. So it's very much a kind of bricolage rather than an assemblage. I don't have very good skills for anything other than kind of tying knots with string. So most of the way I've joined things together, except with clay, which is my discipline, most of these things are just kind of threaded together. These pieces here are actually bits of rusted wrought iron that my father had made, and part of a railing that never kind of got made because he got distracted to do something else. The blocks of wood are found around the shore of the harbour on walks. The blue and white is actually recycled, you know, awning to protect from the sun that's been kind of reworked. And these little pieces here, they are all literally little pinch pots, and they're all from clay that I've actually found on walks. So if you look at them, they're very delicate looking because they're pretty sandy and they've got rocks and pebbles in them. And I'm wanting them to sort of suggest what these corner installations really sort of are trying to suggest in a way is freshwater courses, because of course all around Middle Harbour where there were freshwater courses, that's where Indigenous people lived because they could get access to fresh water. So this is trying to sort of suggest, you know, a cascade and this kind of droop. And then the way that I've suspended the work is by actually using surveyor's pegs. My nephew's actually a surveyor, and so he helped me to get them, but I wanted to use surveyor's pegs because that's the way Europeans try to stake out land and kind of venture in. And so it's a work that's trying to sort of not really give any answers, but just explore for myself some of these contradictions and encounters of both beauty and problematic history, you know, that we live with.